Hello people, I am back and here to talk about He-Man again, because I guess that must be what people want, right? Anyway, so back in 2001, Netflix released a Kevin Smith produced He-Man show called Masters of the Universe Revelation. It did pretty well critically. I think a lot of the critics seemed to quite like it, but when it came to the fans, they were really hard on it. I think some of it was justified, and then a lot of it seemed to just be sexist, racist, all the things that the internet is. And as someone who had just gotten into Masters of the Universe a few months prior, it made them look really bad, like something I didn't want to be a part of. But putting all of those complaints aside, I do think the show did have some problems. I had my gripes with it. For me, it was a bit of a mixed bag. I did a whole video on it. You can go back and watch it if you want to. Some spoilers to follow in this video. First of all, for Revelation, I think starting off your He-Man show with killing off He-Man and having everything be awful now in a show that they didn't advertise that way was sure to get a lot of people upset. I mean, it was done to throw you off. It was done to get people talking about the show. But in its defense, the show is called Masters of the Universe Revelation, not He-Man and the Masters of the Universe Revelation. And I am fine with these types of stories where like an influential hero dies and just seeing how that affects everyone else that's left without them. But I think the main issue I had with it is that it had been 20 years since like the last traditional Masters of the Universe cartoon. I think a traditional He-Man story with powerhouse animation would have been awesome, but instead they chose to go for shock, which is something that you don't usually associate with Masters of the Universe. It just seems like it had been too long a stretch between cartoons to be pulling off something like that. And I'm perfectly fine with them taking risks, but it did not help that the writing wasn't very good either. And of course, by the end of the show, He-Man actually does return, and it kind of does become exactly what people wanted. But there's another problem where they split it into two parts, and I think that was a big mistake as well. People that didn't like the first half did not want to come back for the second half. But as much as I've already talked about it, I'm not really here to talk about Revelation. I'm here to talk about Masters of the Universe Revolution, not to be confused with Dance Dance Revolution.
Let's dance, 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 dance! Dance, dance, revolution!
So this here is the second season of the show, but this really felt to me like they took note of all of the hate that season 1 got and chose to fix that with fan service. And oddly enough, and I hate to say it, it worked for me. So I usually get pretty annoyed when a franchise will kind of excuse a good story for fan service instead. But in the case of He-Man, which really is just a toy commercial, I had a lot of fun with this one. And it's not to say that this one didn't have its own twists and turns. Once again, spoilers. This one starts off with the death of King Randor. I mean, he really just dies because he has to. I don't know if it was cancer or they don't really go into that. He's just dead. Like, okay, we need a plot. Something needs to happen. But to be fair, I mean, who really gives a fuck about King Randor? I can't think of anyone that would care about him dying. But it is the inciting incident that leads to the reveal of Keldor, Randor's secret brother. And he is voiced by William Shatner, which I am very glad because it was rumored that William Shatner was gonna voice Gwildor, and I was like, no, that's not gonna work. But he does a pretty decent job in this. I liked the use of Keldor here. They did a bit more where they kind of mess with the fans, trying to convince you at first that he was a different character, but then it turns out he's actually Skeletor, which does raise some questions. So I didn't read the tie-in comics, but I did look at a few panels from them, and we know that Skeletor was part of a race of like skull-faced beings in those comics. But in this one, they kind of turn that on its head, revealing that Hordak messed with Skeletor's memories to convince him that that was his origin. But I strongly remember a line in the first season where Skeletor says something along the lines of, "I didn't always look like this," which bugged me because according to the comics, he did. And this just kind of further complicates everything because Skeletor's not supposed to remember he was Keldor. Who knows? Who cares? This show is not perfect by any means. There are a lot of fan favorite characters that return in this one, or are just shown for the first time that we didn't see in season 1. I mentioned Hordak, who in this is actually voiced by Keith David, So at first I was like, Keith David, that doesn't really fit Hordak, but once you hear his voice, you're like, yeah, why was I ever complaining about this? I mean, it's Keith David. Speaking of which, Mark Hamill's Skeletor voice, I think really grew on me this season. It was like a great balance of a buffoon who could still be a threat. Other returning characters from the old show include Granomir, who is voiced by John Delancey, which gives me like horrific Vietnam flashbacks to my Brony days. And who could forget dear old Gwildor? So let me explain this one. Gwildor was a character in the canon Masters of the Universe movie, a movie that sucks and people will tell you otherwise, but yeah, it's pretty bad. But I think Orca was out of their budget, so instead they had this little dwarf guy named Gwildor who only showed up for that movie and then never again. But he is a character in this. He gets a team up with Orko, which is something that I never really knew I wanted. But honestly, it was my favorite thing about this season. Just seeing those two comedic sidekicks kind of team up was a lot of fun. And I like that Orko is a lot more competent this season. Like, he's using his magic tricks and they're actually working. There's a lot going on with Teela this season, who is no longer voiced by Sarah Michelle Gellar. Now she's voiced by Melissa Benoist, which I feel does a much better job. I love Sarah Michelle Gellar, don't get me wrong. I just felt she was like extremely miscast in the first season. But Teela is now the new sorceress, and her task in this is that she must retrieve the staffs of Ka, the Havoc staff, and I believe the staff of Ra. Is that what the bird staff is called? I don't remember. But anyway, she must collect these staffs because it will like open a gateway to Preternia and do something magical. I'm feeling like an idiot here because I do not remember the exact purpose of it. But it was cool to see the green serpent version of Teela, which I felt like was used in a very creative way. There's lots of borrowing from bits of lore from He-Man comics and shows, and just kind of putting all of those together here. But it does pose a bit of a problem. I could see people that are not already familiar with He-Man lore being confused by this, especially by Hordak, who is not really explained. Like, most people kind of know him as a She-Ra villain, but if you read He-Man comics, you would know that he's also a He-Man villain. I think there were a few disappointments this season. Most of it has to do with just how few episodes it has. There are only 5 episodes in this season, which is like absolutely ridiculous. Motherboard is also a new character that was teased at the end of season 1. She's kind of built up as like the new big bad, only for her to be killed off screen by Skeletor. I think the show does this thing where it wants to constantly surprise its viewers, but by doing so, it sacrifices just telling a good story. I also think by having her work for Hordak instead of just being her own villain, that felt very fan servicey to me. Despite this, I believe there are some positives to having less episodes. This season was like very direct and to the point, in a similar way to how the Masters of the Universe mini comics were. And in that way, it also kind of felt like a movie. Maybe not like a theatrical movie, but something you would get like a direct-to-video animated film or something like that. So I really believe they did play it safe this season. Maybe that's bad, but to be honest, there's nothing to be mad at here. I'd like to think that a lot more Masters of the Universe fans are going to watch this season and actually enjoy it. And to me, this really did feel like a fitting end to the series, despite the fact that there's teases for more seasons. There was also a small hint at She-Ra earlier in the show, but I kind of doubt the rights issues have really been resolved between like who owns She-Ra and He-Man. There's a whole stupid thing where they're like split up between different companies. It is kind of a shame if they can't use her for the next season, because it feels like to have Hordak and no She-Ra, like something's missing. But overall, I think this was a fun season of a pretty mixed show. Be sure to check it out if you are a Masters of the Universe fan. Otherwise, I don't know, I wouldn't really recommend it to anyone that isn't already a fan. I never do ratings out of 10, but for me this would be like a 7 out of 10. For comparison, the first season I would have given like a 5 or 6, so this is a bit better. I had a lot more fun with it. Well, that's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Be sure to subscribe if you want to check out more videos that are similar to this, and I wish you all a good journey. Bye.